I've been working on theorizing Chinese city for the past few years, and instead of looking at Chinese urbanism as a general condition, I look at examples, look at cases, especially built forms in Beijing. When I was looking at the projects in Beijing, I realized that there are a few projects that significantly redefine Beijing's urban landscape that's actually developed as well as designed by Hong Kong architects. Those projects are shopping malls, commercial spaces, especially post-reform in the 1990s, 2000, 2010. Every sort of decade since the post-reform period, the key sort of civic spaces, so the key of commercial spaces, are actually very much influenced by Hong Kong urbanism. What I mean by Hong Kong urbanism is both the capital as well as the design. So that bring my interest into compare these two cities. Instead of having some kind of a conclusion, I probably here would just start with a few points, a few observations, to be more precise, between the two cities, in order to draw the connection. And then the later discussion probably can go a little further to be a very complement to what I've been working on. So this is where both cities located. I think everybody's sort of familiar with. It would always be the background of all my presentation. I'm trying to remind people that although we always compare East and West, probably North and South could also be comparable in this sort of urban context, both the connection and the disruptions. I was showing the project on the right-hand side to one of my colleagues, Margaret Crawford from UC Berkeley. I explained this project to her. It's a commercial project designed by one of the most sort of important firm in the modernist period in East Asia, Permer and Turner. The chief architect, Remo, is also here, who's going to be our panelist as well. And Margaret said to me that it doesn't look like a commercial building. The commercial building probably should be something on the left. And on the right-hand side, it's a Stalinist architecture. It's a socialist realism architecture. It looks probably more familiar to its adjacent building, which is this Great Hall of People. It's only a few blocks away from the Great Hall of People in Beijing, and then it's also along the Chang'an Avenue. And it reminds her of this kind of grand gesture as the sort of a reminder of China's political origin, of its socialist sort of approach and its pursuit for the size, for the grand gesture, for the monumentality. Nothing that reminds her of commercial spaces, of people, of consumers. This brings me to a very interesting sort of observation. I don't think that Margaret's comment is a criticism per se. It's probably more stating the paradox between the form and the content of the Oriental Plaza. Oriental Plaza, which is on the right-hand side, along the Chang'an Avenue, about a kilometer away from the Tiananmen Square, which is the sort of political center, not just for Beijing, but also for the whole People's Republic of China. I will explain the detail of the project later. But it's one of the first sort of a commercial mixed-use building and one of the most luxurious projects in a post-reform Beijing. It's a massive project, 100,000 square meter. Inside consists of shopping malls, office buildings, hotel, as well as service apartment. It's developed by the richest man of China, Chinese tycoon Li Ka-shing, and designed by Permer Turner, by Mr. Remo River. And for me, that the Stalinist looking or the socialist realism looking is actually a way of taking architecture or taking the sort of physical form as a work of art. It's a way of aestheticizing socialism and its political value in those. The formal character is massive, of course, in size and classical in its building style. And due to the political reasons, Stalinist architecture and and socialist realism influenced both art and architecture practice, aesthetics at the beginning of the People's Republic. However, the socialist realism and the early Russian avant-garde is not necessarily a ruthless rupture. It's as some art historian, for example, Bryce Groys, in his analysis argues that the common thread between the modernist avant-garde, who welcomed the revolution precisely through their enthusiasm for remodeling the world according to their own whim, and the socialist realism, which transcend and discard the lessons and the ethos of the avant-garde, but remodel the work by using certain aspects of the avant-garde vision. In a very recent talk by Izuzaki, he also sort of compared between this huge project, the Soviet Palace, with Malevich's Suprematism sculpture, which they shared very similar formal compositions, but the difference is in detail in the decoration and its style. Therefore, I want to make a quick comparable case here between avant-garde and socialist realism. The idea of socialist realism should not be accepted as a return to should not just be accepted as a return to classicism, but instead a foretaste of sort of a postmodernism. Of course, this kind of approach is an artistic method. I will argue that it's trying to make the reality beautiful. It's trying to make the reality as something that's imagined. It's not a replaced reality, but in fact, it's a justification of the reality itself. What the Oriental Plaza attempt to justify here is the aestheticization should not be only of the political. In the post-reform period, it should also be on the economic. It should not just be on the leaders, the party, but also on its people. The people should not be only positioned as spectators of the reality, but also part of the work, part of the art, part of the participant. Maybe as shoppers, maybe as consumers, as well as maybe as someone that's be part of its constant activity. At the beginning of the economic reform in China, the party leader Deng Xiaoping was attempted to attract capital from West to invest on this 1 billion population huge market. However, the Western investors from the United States as well as from the Europe hesitated in front of this very dilapidated condition, both hardware and software, and one of the sort of Hong Kong economist Stephen Zhang Wuchang illustrated as such that Deng Xiaoping's open and reform policy has made a critical transition from the planning economy to the market economy. However, what's unchanged is both economies are still state-driven. So the inevitable marketization project is driven instead of by the market, but still by the state. So during this transition, what used to be the center to manifest the political power as Beijing has been deliberately convoluted by economic motivation. Instead of adopting, like what I just mentioned, Western capitalist mode of liberal marketization, China, both from the geopolitical, cultural, and social and historical point of view, that prefer to learn from the model of four little dragons, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. And among the four, Hong Kong by nature has the most immediate impact to mainland China. At the beginning, it was the small Hong Kong merchants and businessmen, entrepreneurs autonomously enter Shenzhen, Dongguan, the cities that around Hong Kong, and start their small business and manufactories. And the Hong Kong's developer and investors were warmly invited by the state to mainland China. Together with the small capitalists were the Hong Kong pop music, TV, film, and the associated lifestyle. For a family, for normal people in mainland China at that time, becoming Hong Kong is far more real and familiar than anything else. The city is arguably the most explicit index of power relation. As such, Chinese contemporary city, post-reform especially, underneath the complex phenomenon of urbanization, can be conceptualized according to two extreme logics. One is driven by political power, while the other is by economic power. Between the political and the economic, two cities in China can be identified as the most extreme manifestation that defines either end of the spectrum. Beijing is exemplified as driven by political power, while Hong Kong is propelled by economic power. The dialectics between Hong Kong and Beijing, the economic and the political, introduce an archetypal contrast that will appear and reappear through the contemporary Chinese history of urban formation in every new incarnation. Hong Kong's architecture has been recognized only within a very specific geopolitical context and architecture genre. It has been ignored by the mainstream architectural discourse. It's if not even criticized for lacking of resistance and being compromised with capital or consumerism. However, stripped from its architectural, its flourishing architectural language, Hong Kong's architecture can be understood through its irreducible urban types that invented or adopted in this sort of culture of urban congestion. Atriums, corridor, arcade, slab, tower, podium, etc. Therefore, the only way to confront the architecture of Hong Kong is to overcome the reality and beyond architecture as a design of object, but entering to the political and economical process of producing architecture. It can be argued that the shopping mall, the shopping space, commercial spaces is one of the most common typologies in Hong Kong. In fact, Hong Kong's commercial developers has been active in shaping Beijing's shopping spaces in every important ages since the post-reform period. At the beginning, it was World Trade Center in the 1990s that to redefine the mixed use. And then the Xingdongan Market and Oriental Plaza, which I'm going to go into detail later, that along the Chang'an Avenue. And then the Sanlitun Village and Indigo. Every sort of few years, there's a Hong Kong developed projects that redefine the sort of commercial spaces in Beijing. I'm looking at this two particular for a few reasons. One is that these two projects sort of are more mature in terms of its form and its program, and the second is that it's within the sort of the most important political spaces in Beijing, in Wangfujing, that's not far from the Tiananmen Square. And then these two projects are adjacent to each other. Both are here. And their stories, however, are very different and unique to each other. First, I'm going to talk about the Xingdongan. Xingdongan is a joint venture between a local developer and Sing Hong Kai from Hong Kong. And the location, the project started about Xingdongan Market. Dong'an Market is one of the oldest temple fair in Beijing. It started about 150 years ago. And it was held periodically in concurrent with the ritual ceremonies. the Xindong'an market is the site for the temple fair, and then eventually it started to become more and more solid and physical. In the 1990s, in the 19th century, the temple fair was reconstructed as a market, and it was not far from the Tiananmen Square, and at that time it's the entrance for the Forbidden City. So a lot of merchants start to gather in this area and to form this kind of temporary market, this place after the original gathering, small autonomous gathering, the Qing old Qing dynasty attempt to reform by learning from Western capitalists to encourage commerce and business development. So starting from here, the foreign merchants also start to sell their goods here, and this also became the first international market in Beijing. By adopting a more flexible regulatory ways of government-run and private operate, the new form of the Dong'er market start to appear, and the beginning during the Cultural Revolution, it becomes a small shops, the agglomeration of small shops, and then after the Cultural Revolution, it turns into a public own private-run company, and then because of the earthquake in the 1976, the government decided to redevelop this area, and by that time there's a debate of building typology start to appear. This debate is between whether this project should be constructed as a continuation of department store, or it should be something else, which is more modern. What I mean by department store, which this one is a typical department store, which is a block away from the Xindong'an market. As we can see, this is a quite modernist plan with the pilotis, with the columns, and it reminds you probably of Le Corbusier's Maison Domino. And the circulation appears at the four corners to emphasize the efficiency and also the orientation of the plan. The structure is therefore organized, very well organized, and emphasizing the efficiency. And in 1992, Tsinghua University, which is one of the most important architecture school, and its design institute start to design this new development. And then what they did is to continue the idea of department store to emphasize the efficiency of the floor plan and the more well-organized plan, and then to make it bigger, to occupy the whole lot with the columns, regulatory columns, and also the staircases, all in a very well-organized way. However, when the Senghong-Kai involved in the project, the shopping mall typology came in, and then the shopping mall it's a collaboration that then they start to bring in new designers, new architects. RTKL from the United States and Wang Tong from Hong Kong collaborate on this shopping mall scheme. Similar in terms of the floor areas, as we can see. Shopping mall scheme is almost 2 times larger in volume than the department store scheme. So by introducing 2 large voids, one is here and the other is here, the overall shopping space was truncated into 3 parts. On both ends are the department store, while in the middle are shopping streets that are organized along the atrium. This design strategy does not seem to be innovative in Hong Kong, but it actually it's the first time appear such large sort of atrium space first appear in Beijing. So by positioning two voids in the building, efficiency is then compromised and replaced by this kind of experience. All the sort of familiar tricks of shopping spaces design appear here. For example, limited entrances, escalator placed only at the end of corridor, fountains and benches carefully positioned to entice shoppers into stores. The control of the flow of consumers through the repetitive corridor of shops, the orderly procession of goods along endless arcade of Oriental Plaza of this Xinduan continues stimulate the desire to buy, and while in contrast that if the Xinduan market is a vivid sort of example of evolution of urban types starting from rather informal market and then gradually into a building. The transformation of Xindong'an is very transparent and traceable. Oriental Plaza here emerged as a locus of sort of a political conflict, of which architectural form is one of the most sort of obvious or radical manifestation. In order to make room for the construction, this is a huge and important plot next to the major boulevard in Beijing. The demolition is huge, and 20 state departments, 40 municipal offices, and 100 district level units and 1,800 local residents were replaced. And in addition, the first McDonald's, as we can see here, also located on the site. And then it's a miracle stated by the local planning bureau that the project can remove also this very symbolic construction. This project is designed by Perma and Turner. The concept of form was derived from two Chinese traditional motifs, gate and a courtyard. Beyond the concept, the deep structure remains as the most sort of a generic commercial development typology, as we can see here, both in Hong Kong and as well as the projects in Beijing. Is the towers on top of the podium. And the podium locates the shopping street connecting two department stores anchoring both ends, while the towers are the offices, hotels, and service apartments. The building is stepped, as we can see here. According to the visibility from the Forbidden City, the lower part is facing the Forbidden City and has to be cut into half from 70 meters to 30 to 40 meters. As such, the price for each floor is almost double, and it therefore becomes the most economic privileged place in the city. If the urban form of Xindong'an can be summarized as the progressive prevalence of space over form, the project that we have seen is a common denominator of being the result of a politics via soft urban management rather than the explicit political representation. The Oriental Plaza would be a revisit for such gradualism. Plaza in Chinese is guangchang, and the exact same word as square as Tiananmen Square. It's just a block away from the square, and Tiananmen Guangchang will erect as another guangchang. It will be an open linear political space, but a depoliticized linear sort of interior shopping street. It's a deliberate distraction to the singularity of the Tiananmen Square. However, no matter how intentional this project is to emancipate the city from its old means, it can never challenge the power internally embedded in the Tiananmen. It has to be renamed from Guangchang to Xintiandi, a new world. It is indeed a new world along the political axis of Chang'an Avenue to redefine the singularity of the political power. In contrast to the older Beijing plan, although it's Well, although it's less ambitious, its realization, however, is not to duplicate, but to add another layer to the dominance of the state control and harbinger even bolder intervention and transformation. Shopping space, as some scholars might call as a non-place. Non-place means that, for example, shopping, airport, hotel, offices, that refers to the sort of anthropological spaces of transience that do not hold enough significance to be regarded as places. We're different from piazza, church, those sort of spaces that embedded with our collective memory and material environment. There is little identity, relationship, and history in shopping, in airport, and in hotels. Non-space breaks the relations between space and identity. Here, the Hong Kong's commercial intervention into the political center of Beijing disassociate what used to be identified as political to a non-space, to a non-place. One has to be beyond the political identity of people, but to obtain a new identity as mass, a member, a consumer, as a traveler, as a shopper. Such a new identity is given by the introduced urban types in the shopping environments, atrium, arcade, corridor, escalator, as I just mentioned, which is already familiar by the people with its history and relationships with Hong Kong culture. Oh, sorry. One design principle identified by a Hong Kong shopping mall developer is called indirect commodification, a process by which non-sellable objects, activities, and images are purposefully placed in the commodified world of mall. The basic marketing principle is adjacent attraction, where the most dissimilar objects lend each other mutual support are placed next to each other. Richard Sennett explains this effect as a temporary suspension of the use value of the object. Its discontextualized state makes it unexpected and therefore stimulating. This logic of association allows non-commodified values to enhance commodity, but it also imposes the reverse process. Previously non-commodified entity became part of the marketplace. Once this exchange of attributes is absorbed into the already open-ended and indeterminate exchange between commodity and needs, association can resonate infinitely. The principle of adjacent attraction is now operating at a societal and political level, imposing an exchange of attributes between the square and the plaza, between the political and the economic, between Hong Kong and Beijing. Well, my research start as open question is whether Hong Kong and Beijing become more and more comparable or disconnected. Whether what we see here is a way that Beijing using Hong Kong as an instrument to promote or to provoke economic development, or the other way around, Hong Kong using Beijing as a sort of a political agenda. That's an open question. Well, thank you very much.